Self-Reliance by Ernest Holmes. First of all, the man with spiritual self-reliance must believe in God. It makes no great difference just what religious faith he has, for fundamental to all faith is a belief in God. Everything else is non-essential. First of all, then, and fundamental to everything else, is this faith in a power greater than we are. Next, and equally necessary, is faith in ourselves. And the kind of faith in ourselves we are talking about is, of course, not in an isolated self, as though we were struggling alone, but rather faith in a spiritual self, because this type of self-reliance comes only to those who have a deep conviction not only about God, but about themselves. Therefore, this kind of self-reliance must have, as one of the mainsprings of its being, the conviction that man is a living spirit, that he has his being in a power greater than he is, and a power that responds to him. We all believe that God is, and we all believe that we live because God lives in us. And we think because the mind of God thinks through us, we should think intelligently and act creatively, because the mind that created everything is creating something new in us right now. Here are the first steps, then, in acquiring spiritual self-reliance: to believe in God with our whole being, to believe in the reality of our spiritual selves as forever one with God, and to establish a continual communion with that God who is both within and round about us. And last but not least, we find that all the great souls have acted on their vision. Having received it, they no longer remain passive. They carried the vision into action in human affairs. They were like people who listened to some celestial music in the silence of their souls, then sing it over again that others may hear it. They were those who went into the secret place of the Most High within themselves and received the healing balm of life, and then took it into the marketplace that others could be made whole. Jesus applied his spiritual power for every sort of purpose: the healing of the sick, feeding the multitude, and all the other miraculous things that took place in his experience. All of these were a direct result of having followed the first three rules fundamental to acquiring spiritual self-reliance: belief in God, belief in your own spiritual self, communion with God, talking to God, letting God talk to you, and then out of the inspiration that comes, carrying this power and this conviction into the affairs of everyday life. Let us then see how this would work out in our experience. And let's start with a suppositional case of someone who lacks confidence in himself. He has no self-reliance whatsoever. He thinks of himself as weak and inadequate, and he is filled with fear and disappointment. He is frustrated because his fondest hopes have been shattered on the rocks of experience. His boat is adrift on an ocean of uncertainty. Seems as there were no chart, no compass, no guide, no pilot, only aimless and uncertain drifting. Now we have described a pretty forlorn hope, haven't we? At least the prodigal son is as far away from his home as he could ever expect to be. And it was right here in this distant land, in this faraway place, that something happened to him. Something happened within him which he hadn't put there. Something which God had put there caused him to remember who and what he was. And so something within him did remember, and it whispered to him that things might be different. And this is hope. Hope coming like a gleam of light from an invisible source. And the will to listen. It is apparent in the story that the prodigal son did listen. He communed with God because everything else had failed. He listened to God because everything else he had been hearing was false and confusing. And just what happened to him at this point? Up until now, he had been out on his own. He had been all alone, so to speak, and he had become frustrated and destitute. And then at long last, he had begun to think, to listen, to talk to that something which he dimly remembered, just as we all do. And that something responded to him and brought with it a vision, the vision of a better life, the vision of a father's house, of loving associates, and a home for which he so greatly longed. Suppose that everything had stopped right there. He would have merely had a beautiful dream, a dream from which he must so soon awake, only to find himself plunged even more deeply into despair. But a new determination came to him, the will to act backed by the impulse of faith, and a whole new energy flowed into him, feeling and imagination. And even this wasn't enough, for the will to act must be followed by the action, so that the will itself passes into action and becomes the act. It is only in this way that we can hook up our desire and feeling and creativity with accomplishment. And so the prodigal arose and started on the return journey.